Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's interview. I am Francesca DeMeglio, the editor of HR Exchange Network, and today I'll be talking to Dave Millner. He is the author of The Introduction to People Analytics, a practical guide to data-driven HR. He wrote this with Nadeem Khan, and he will share with us a little bit about why HR needs to pay a lot more attention to the almighty data. So stay tuned and check it out. Thank you. Hello. Let's
Hi
talk a
there.
little bit about your book. We're really excited to have you here with us. So tell me about the book. I believe this is a second edition.
Yes, that's right. So the first edition was written in 2020. It was launched on the first day of lockdown here in the UK.
Wow.
So that wasn't good timing. It was really the book then, and the book, the second edition now, is really aimed at the HR practitioner. Okay, it's not aimed at people analytics specialists, albeit a lot of specialists have bought it and apparently have found it interesting and of use. But really what it's trying to do is to try and get HR to think in a data orientated way, to try and consider how they need to change in terms of how they deal with their internal customers and how they look at talent related issues. So the book is really trying to take them through a step-by-step process to try and understand that A, data's not going away. B, it's not quite as scary as you might think. And that three, we're not trying to make every HR person a statistical genius, but what we are doing is we do need to make you more data orientated in the way that you look at issues. So that's a very big overview about what it is.
Yeah, well, I really am drawn to the point you just made about data not being scary because I think a lot of HR practitioners hear data and
Yes.
get scared. That's the initial reaction. Tell me a little bit about why they shouldn't be scared and how data can really help them do a better job.
I think that the key thing for me is that if you think about, okay, some people may not be good at very mathematics, okay, but what we're trying to do here is to try and make HR a bit more data literate. So how can I understand numbers? How can I make sense of them? How can I maybe even use them a little bit in some presentations or conversations with my customers? And so I think the key thing that I've found is that the more that you talk to them about it, the more that you show and share examples about what other HR practitioners have done, they start to understand that, oh, I could do that. I've got that data and I could have done. And what it's trying to do is it's trying to say, yes, I could do that. Because, you know, uh, numbers really for me are the, if you like, they are what people is all about today. And I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, but, numbers are people. And as long as we retain our sort of advocate role in terms of remembering that behind every number is a person, and that we remember that, I think what we've got to try and do is to ensure that we as an HR function talk the language of the organization, and more importantly talk the language of the business in which they're in, because we've got to somehow make sure that we connect with the leaders and that we make sure everything that we do is aligned with the strategy of the organization. I'm afraid the days of just trust me, I'm an HR person and so I know what to do, that isn't going to work anymore. And we've got to be much smarter, much more commercial, I think, in the way that we view issues and challenges. Because, for example, if we just look at budgets, we cannot appreciate and cannot just assume that because we had so much money spent last year that we're going to get the same amount of money this year. And every function is looking to make sure that they invest in the right way. And I think, HR, as far as I'm concerned, is probably one of the most important functions in the organization. I would say that. But what we've got to do is we've got to try and demonstrate that. We've got to try and prove it. And, it can be a little bit, it needs a bit of courage to put your faith in numbers and to say, I predicted that we could do this. and we've not quite done it, but we've still added value, that's quite a brave conversation that you have to have. So this is not an easy initiative in any shape or form. And that's why I suppose, it's the second edition. Maybe I got the first one wrong, or maybe I've just learned a lot on my journey of hundreds of workshops with HR practitioners across the globe. Who knows?
Well, why do you say you got it wrong?
Well, I wouldn't say wrong, but the second edition I think is better than the first. I think it's got 40 case studies in it. Big thanks to the vendors and the clients. Is a much broader range of examples now. Going from how do we make an impact with metrics through to workforce planning, scenario planning, using technology systems better. So I just think that this version is probably more comprehensive. I think I've made it more organized in a way that makes it easier to dip in and out. The book, just to reassure your listeners, has 2 pages of numbers in it. Okay, there are 400 pages in the book. There are only 2 pages of numbers, and they are there to explain a case study. So, if hopefully that can reassure people to make sure that this is not about showing you statistical equations and getting you to think about that. It's really getting at, what data do I need? How can I make sense of it? If I've got an analytics team, how can I work better with that team? And finally, how can we then collectively tell a good story to our business leaders that says, we can do this, we're going to add value, we need your backing and your support to do that. And, it can work. And I think that, as I said at the very beginning, data and analytics is not going to go away. This is not another HR fad. It's been around for, I don't know, 12, 13 years now. So, we've got to really embrace it, I think.
I would agree. I think that it's not going anywhere. I think your point about how you have to align HR with the business objectives and make a case for yourself and what talent management is all about. That's going to continue, obviously, especially as things get more competitive, as the businesses look to keep smaller groups of employees. You're going to need to have that vital information.
Absolutely.
One of the things we've always heard, one of our advisory board members at HR Exchange Network, Stephanie Murphy, she was formerly the head of people analytics at Dell and is now a professor at University of Texas. She always says to me that people analytics is really storytelling. And
Yes.
I think that's a wonderful way to look at it. Do you have any reaction to that belief system?
Oh, absolutely. I think, I think the critical thing, if I look even at myself, yes, I can do the stats. I'm an occupational or industrial psychologist, as you would say in America. So I can do the stats. But to be honest, I'm a storyteller, and I get people to do the numbers for me because they can do it better, quicker, faster, and they know all the new tech and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And I think the critical thing is about making sure that you get people to focus on what are the key messages you want to get across. And the most critical tip I would say is, please do not demonstrate all your amazing statistical work that's been done either by you or by your analytical colleagues. Keep it simple, because the critical thing is you want people to listen to what you've got to say. We're trying to add numbers to add greater value and to make better impact. And I've always said, look, if you want to see the numbers, look at it after the meeting, look at it in the appendix, but we're not going to show you those, because the critical thing here is, what have we found out? What are we thinking about? What are the issues? And more importantly, what do we suggest that you should be giving some consideration to regarding investment, change, whatever it may be? So I absolutely agree with Stephanie. It is a storytelling, and you can have the most complex and most brilliant statistical analysis ever, but if you can't tell the story, nobody's going to agree and do anything about it. So I think you're absolutely right. Those stories are very important. And it's just a very simple metric. There are examples in the book about very simple metrics and where we've just added a business number to it, and suddenly it makes it much more impactful, and it suddenly creates a lot of attention with the business leaders. And I think we've got to think in that way about how can we credibly, attract attention and impact. And as I said earlier, it does require a bit of courage. But after all, we're supposed to be HR business partners with emphasis on the business, not as much emphasis on the HR and people. And I think, we've got to come full circle and start to go back to what Ulrich was originally talking about as being partners with the business.
Absolutely. So I love how you say that it takes courage. Talk to us about that. Why does it take courage, and what do you mean by that?
Okay, I think the critical thing for data is that data drives accountability. Okay, you are responsible for achieving a particular number or highlighting that this particular something will happen. So that takes some accountability. And so if you are therefore saying, look, we've done this research, I've done this seems to be a trend or a pattern, be it, I know, at a simple level, absenteeism, or, people leaving, attrition and retention. And when you start to say, look, this is what the number is telling us, I believe we need to do the following, and that means we're going to need to invest X. And that means that if we're going to do that investment, that could, I believe, mean that we're going to save approximately Y. Now, that's quite brave, because people, and inevitably a business leader, will say, so how did you reach that conclusion? So you've then got to be very clear about what you've done, how you've compiled the data, where it's come from, and where you've drawn those conclusions, whether it's a hypothesis or whether it's based on historical data. So that's quite brave, because, we've got to remember that most of the time HR practitioners are talking to people who are more senior, should know better because, they've got more experience, who will probably think they're expert in people's stuff until we hit some problems. So, the whole cocktail there is quite a challenging one. And I think that's really where we've got to be very careful about how we use this, whether we don't overstate it and that we don't overpromise. I always prefer to underestimate, underpromise and overachieve. I think that's always where I would like to try and be in this whole space.
That's great advice for life in general. So I appreciate that. Is there anything else you'd want our readers to know about your book, about your work in people analytics?
I think the critical thing for me, we've got to, within the book, I've managed to collect, I've run about 200 workshops since the first edition. Okay. And so I've collected a lot of data. So data that tells me commercial acumen, financially, HR has a lot of work to do. We don't understand the financial way in which an organization operates. So, for me, if there's nothing else, you need to get closer to finance. And I know that's almost heresy, isn't it? I don't want you to become a financial person, but we do need to understand where your business makes money. Where are the jobs that are connected to where you make the most money? So we've got to think in a more commercial way. I've collected a lot of time about where do HR business partners spend their time. 38% of their time they spend on solving operational puzzles.
Oh, interesting.
I'll just hold but for a moment what that means, So, I was a prototype business partner in 1997, a long time ago in the UK. And that what I found from the data is that by the time you look at, those solving puzzles, compliance, logistics, implementing maybe some talent practices or supporting people, that's about 2/3 of an HR business partner's job. So that leaves them with 1/3 of their time to do strategic partnering, which for me is about looking at tomorrow, not looking at today. And, you haven't got time to do this reporting. So we've almost gone full circle from the data I've collected that says we're now got a business partner who's now operating like the old HR manager. And you've got to think, is that because they're in their comfort zone? Is that because the people managers aren't really very good at people managers? So what do we need to do? So there's a whole series of dynamics that relate to how you can use reporting and data. So the book, I think, tends to go into other broader issues, more than just looking at data and analytics, because the whole thing is intertwined, I believe. And I think if I look at some of the amazing people analytics teams that are out there, they're successful because they are a key part of the HR team, and they are a key part of how they work with the business functions. Isn't that what all HR functions should do? Exactly. But we all know that sometimes people get in the way, I guess. And, it's one of those things. So I think the critical thing for me is we have got to make sure that HR provides business credible solutions. I always focus on what's the business problem, not what's the people problem. If somebody talks to me about absenteeism, I'm not interested in absenteeism. I am, but I'm more interested in what impacts that having on productivity. What impacts it having on your customer experience? Now, if you then start your leaders to think about that and the importance of absenteeism in relation to those things, that's where I think HR suddenly has got a connection to deal with business issues as much as trying to resolve the underlying people issue at the same time. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, it's a way to get support from the leadership who are outside of HR, and so that they can understand the relevance to their final outcomes.
Yeah.
Ultimately, that's
And I
what.
think we've got to get much better at making that connection between
Yeah,
the problem that's thrown at us and actually understanding, well, what impact does that have on the business, on the team, on the function that you're dealing with? And I think we've got to get smarter at doing that, because then you can start to say, so what data have you got to back that up, to give me an indication about what the impact of it is, so that suddenly it's not just about absenteeism's gone up by 3 or 4%. It's actually productivity's gone down by 3%, and that equates to X amount of dollars. And that is the problem we need to get our head around. So that's the data-driven approach that I really want to try and get HR practitioners to think about, and which really, I suppose, sums up the book in many ways, of just getting you to think in that different way. It's a mindset shift, I know, but we've got to do it, because if we don't, HR is going to remain, looking for the infamous phrase, a seat at the table, and all of this stuff. Pointless having a seat at the table if you've got nothing to say. So,
that's right.
we have got to be immersed in what the business challenges are, and we've got to really connect with those.
I agree, couldn't agree more. I think that those seats at the table are being taken by those in HR now. And you're right, if they want to keep them, they're going to have to understand data and make these arguments. I would also argue, though, that some of the leaders on the other side of the table might need some help with the people skills. So
Yeah, oh, I
they
absolutely,
can help each other.
you're absolutely right. I think we've got to remember is that a leadership role is a really tough gig.
It
Okay.
is.
And maybe, it's easy to sort of, oh, you should have done this and you should have done that. But I think back to my courage, we've got to be braver about challenging them and saying, you know what, that's not a really clever thing to do. I think you should be doing this. I've heard about this, I've seen that. And that's why one of the critical things that through a theme throughout the book is, it's about, you have got to be on a continuous learning journey, because the day you stop learning, I think you need to leave HR, because we have got to get much better at understanding what's going on both internally but also externally. But it comes back to your place of finding stories to convince and seduce some of your people managers to say, actually, that sounds really good. I think that's interesting. How can I do a bit more around that?
I think that's great, a great point, and the perfect place to end this interview. So, thank you all for joining us today. And I hope you'll stay tuned to hrexchangenetwork.com for further interviews and more news on all that's happening in the HR world. Thank you so much for joining us today.